Hello, friends. Tonight we're diving into the grim, dangerous, and surprisingly diverse world of medieval assassins. And yes, I said diverse, because it turns out there were many different ways to make a living by making people stop living. While Hollywood loves to paint these shadowy figures as mysterious loners trained in mountaintop temples, the reality was far messier, more varied, and infinitely more depressing. Some were desperate peasants, others were religious fanatics. A few were even what you might generously call professionals. But they all shared one thing in common. They'd chosen a career path with absolutely terrible job security and even worse, retirement benefits. So before we begin this journey through history's most inadvisable profession, take a moment to like the video and a subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy learning about people whose life choices make your worst career decisions look brilliant. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world to learn about medieval murder. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Grab your imaginary rusty dagger, practice your paranoid glances, and let's explore why being a medieval assassin was terrible in more ways than anyone ever imagined. Let's start with a crucial point that Hollywood consistently gets wrong. There wasn't just one type of medieval assassin stumbling around Europe with questionable hygiene and a death wish. The profession varied dramatically depending on where and when you lived, who you worked for, and what desperate circumstances or twisted ideologies drove you to consider throat slitting as a viable career option. Let's begin with the classic image, the desperate European peasant with nothing to lose and everything to stab. This is the version most people picture when they think medieval assassin. And frankly, it's the most depressing. No one in medieval Europe woke up and said, "You know what, I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days?" Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like the last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Most European assassins were exactly what you'd expect. Desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with decent aim, or people so far off society's radar they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had a reputation for solving problems with sharp objects, and could sneak into a tavern without being seen, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a coin purse across a table and whisper a name, and that name wasn't going to be Bob the quiet turnip farmer. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Persia, some very religious people were turning murder into a fine art. Enter the Nizari Ismailis, the original assassins from whom we get the very word. These weren't desperate peasants stumbling around with rusty daggers. These were ideologically committed, professionally trained operatives who believed they were serving God. Based in mountain fortresses like Alamut Castle, under the leadership of figures like Hassan-i Sabah, the legendary Old Man of the Mountain, the Nizaris developed what might be the world's first organized assassination program. They weren't doing it for coin purses. They were doing it for paradise, which, career-wise, has better long-term benefits, but significantly worse short-term survival rates. The key difference here was motivation. European assassins were usually driven by desperation. Nizari assassins were driven by religious conviction. They genuinely believed that killing the right people would earn them eternal reward. This made them far more dangerous because they weren't trying to survive the job. They were trying to die gloriously while completing it. Their targets weren't random nobles either. They assassinated crusader leaders, rival Muslim rulers, and anyone who threatened their particular branch of Shia Islam. They were strategic, patient, and absolutely terrifying to their enemies. In Constantinople, assassination wasn't a crime. It was a career ladder. The Byzantine Empire perfected the art of civilized murder, turning political elimination into an elegant dance of palace intrigue. Byzantine assassins weren't hooded figures creeping through alleys. They were palace eunuchs with access and ambition. court officials with poison rings, or foreign agents operating under diplomatic cover. They killed with silk scarves, poison jewelry, and carefully timed accidents during imperial ceremonies. The irony is delicious. The most civilized and Christian empire in the medieval world had perhaps the most sophisticated assassination apparatus. They turned murder into an art form, complete with proper etiquette and imperial approval. These weren't desperate criminals. They were functionaries. Assassination was just another tool of statecraft, like taxation or diplomacy, but with more immediate results and fewer appeals processes. In Renaissance Italy, assassination became so common they practically had business licenses for it. The Italian city-states turned political murder into a thriving urban industry. Unlike castle infiltration in Northern Europe, Italian assassination was street-level work. Crowds provided cover, festivals offered opportunities, and the maze-like streets of cities like Venice and Florence were perfect for quick escapes. You didn't need to scale walls or fight through guards. You just needed to blend into a crowd and disappear into the urban labyrinth. Some Italian cities actually did regulate assassins through guild connections and professional networks. You could find trained killers the same way you'd hire a carpenter or baker, through recommendations and professional references. It was murder with customer service. The Borgias elevated this to an art form, treating assassination like any other political tool. Need a rival eliminated. There's a professional for that. Need it done quietly. Premium service available. Need it to look like an accident. That'll cost extra, but it's certainly doable. Now that we've established the diverse world of medieval assassination, let's talk about how these people learned their deadly trade. Spoiler alert, most of them didn't. For most aspiring assassins, training consisted of 3 simple steps. Try not to die, try to kill someone, repeat until you achieve one of those goals permanently. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where nobles kept their bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill, wondering if you'd just crept into the servants' quarters again. Most people learned assassination the way we learned not to touch hot stoves, through immediate, painful feedback. Medieval Darwinism in action. Those who survived their first few attempts might pick up some skills from thieves, soldiers, or desperate circumstances. Those who didn't, well, they contributed to the learning experience of others. Poison was trial and error with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and more suspicious of a suit. Sometimes you drank the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline, just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. If you were lucky, and I mean lottery-winning lucky, you might have picked up some skills from an older assassin, a retired soldier, or even a barber surgeon who knew where to cut for maximum effect. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because assassins don't retire. They disappear. But some assassins went to what could generously be called Murder University. The Nizari Ismailis didn't just grab random fanatics and hand them daggers. They had actual training programs. Young men selected for the assassination corps learned languages, philosophy, combat techniques, and infiltration methods. They studied their targets' habits, learned to blend into different cultures, and mastered the art of patient observation. These weren't martial arts montages with inspirational flute music, but they weren't bumbling around in the dark either. The twist, they were often better educated than most nobles. A Nizari assassin might speak 4 languages, quote poetry, discuss theology, and kill you with a hairpin, all while maintaining perfect dinner conversation. Similar programs existed in other regions. Byzantine court schools trained young men in the arts of diplomacy, espionage, and discreet elimination. Chinese imperial courts had whole departments dedicated to special operations. Even some Italian merchant houses maintained what they called security consultants, who received professional training. If you were really lucky, an older assassin might take pity on you and teach you how to walk without squeaking on cobblestones. Maybe they'd show you how to mix a poison that actually worked, or explain why killing someone in their own bedroom was generally a terrible idea. But mentoring was dangerous for both parties. Every person who knew your identity was a potential liability. Every student was someone who might betray you, compete with you, or simply screw up so badly that it traced back to you. Guild-adjacent training existed in major cities where organized crime had developed professional standards. Venetian security consultants might pool resources for training, share techniques, and even provide something resembling professional development. But these were exceptions, not rules. The problem with teachers was simple. They tended to disappear suddenly, whether through professional hazards, employer betrayal, or simple bad luck. Mentors had a habit of achieving involuntary career termination just when you needed them most. Most European assassins were essentially self-taught disasters waiting to happen. They picked up medical knowledge from barber surgeons, learned about poisons through dangerous experimentation, and developed infiltration techniques through sheer desperation. Some gained anatomy knowledge from physicians willing to answer hypothetical questions about where to stab someone for maximum effect. Others learned from executioners who understood the practical mechanics of efficient killing. A few even studied with midwives who knew which herbs could end a pregnancy or a life. But for every successful autodidact, there were dozens of corpses representing failed experiments in medieval murder. Learning by doing only works if you survive the doing. And most amateur assassins discovered their limitations the hard way. Let's talk gear. Forget the fantasy novels and video games with their retractable wrist blades and smoke bombs. Medieval assassins had to work with whatever they could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak. If your assassination budget was whatever I can steal, your toolkit looked like a medieval yard sale. Most European freelancers carried whatever they could acquire through theft, barter, or creative salvage. A good dagger was essential. Not ornate, not curved like a dragon's tooth, just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you stabbed with it. If you couldn't afford good steel, you made do with whatever sharp object presented itself. Slate roof tiles, rusty nails, shoe buckles with intent. Desperate times called for creative weaponry. Poison existed, but it wasn't the elegant solution portrayed in stories. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable concoctions made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some worked instantly, some took hours, and some just made your victim vomit for 2 days before recovering angrier and more suspicious than before. A rope was occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or tie something up with one, but you'd better know how to use it fast because nothing kills the element of surprise like trying to wrestle someone while muttering, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" Some lucky killers got the medieval equivalent of company benefits. If you worked for a wealthy patron, religious organization, or established criminal network, your equipment might actually be designed for the job. Islamic alchemical poisons were sophisticated affairs. Muslim physicians and scholars had detailed knowledge of toxicology, creating refined preparations that worked predictably and efficiently. A Nizari assassin might carry compounds that would make your European hedge witch's mushroom brew look like children's finger paints. Byzantine court assassins had access to imperial arsenals. They didn't carry rusty daggers. They had quality steel, specialized tools, even early firearms by the later medieval period. Some carried poisoned jewelry, rings with hidden compartments, or ceremonial items that concealed deadly surprises. Italian guild assistants could pool resources for professional equipment. Well-made stilettos, reliable crossbow bolts, professionally prepared poisons, murder with quality control and customer satisfaction guarantees. Let's talk about the medieval assassin's Swiss Army knife, which was usually just a knife. But regional specializations developed based on local needs and available technology. Garrotes were elegant solutions for quiet work. A length of wire or cord with handles could strangle silently and efficiently, though it required getting uncomfortably close to your target and maintaining physical control throughout the process. Not for the squeamish or weak of arm, early firearms appeared in the later medieval period, giving some assassins ranged capabilities. These weren't accurate or reliable, but they were loud, intimidating, and could punch through armor. The downside, everyone within a mile knew exactly where the shot came from. Crossbows were the sniper rifles of their day. Accurate, powerful, and reasonably quiet. The problem was size and reload time. You couldn't exactly hide one under your cloak, and after your first shot, you'd better hope you didn't need a second one. Medieval poison was like medieval medicine. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it made things worse, and sometimes everyone involved ended up dead. The quality and reliability varied dramatically by region and available expertise. In the Islamic world, poison was practically a science. Scholars like Al-Jazari and others had written detailed treatises on toxicology. Professional poisoners could create compounds with predictable onset times, symptoms, and lethality rates. They knew about antidotes, detection methods, and how to avoid accidental self-poisoning. European poison was more like expensive Russian roulette. Most preparations were based on folklore, guesswork, and dangerous experimentation. Testing poison was an occupational hazard that claimed almost as many assassins as their targets. The dinner party problem was real. How do you poison one person at a table without affecting others? Professional poisoners developed targeted delivery methods. Poison jewelry that transferred toxins through skin contact. Needle-thin applicators for discreet dosing. Even trained animals that could deliver fatal bites on command. Now let's discuss the people you'd be expected to kill. Because contrary to popular belief, not all assassination targets were heavily fortified nobles hiding behind castle walls. If you thought sneaking into a modern building was hard, try doing it when everyone expects you and the door is 30 feet off the ground. Castle assassination was PhD-level difficulty, requiring months of planning, multiple backup strategies, and a healthy acceptance of probable death. Your target lived behind walls designed to keep out armies. There were guards, not one or two, but dozens, armed, armored, well-fed, and paid to notice unusual things like strangers with suspicious bulges under their cloaks. Some guarded the front, some the back, and some just stood there looking intimidating, daring you to blink wrong. The architecture itself was your enemy. Castles didn't have front porches. They had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats full of things that bite. If you didn't fall into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits, boiling oil, and the charming medieval tradition of dropping large stones on uninvited guests. Then there were the servants, cooks, scribes, stable boys, laundresses. One wrong look from you, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Medieval gossip traveled at light speed, especially when it meant someone got to keep their head by reporting suspicious behavior. But sometimes the smart move was waiting for them to come out. Nobles did travel, attend events, go hunting, or visit other castles. Patient assassins learned to strike when their targets were away from their strongest defenses. Italian city-states turned assassination into an urban art form, and the tactics were completely different from castle infiltration. Cities offered opportunities that fortresses never could. Crowds for cover, multiple escape routes, and targets who moved through public spaces. Street-level assassination required different skills. You needed to read crowd patterns, identify unmarked guards, and blend into urban environments. A successful city assassin could disappear into a marketplace in seconds, using the chaos of daily commerce as cover. Festival assassinations were particularly popular during religious celebrations, civic events, or market days. Even the most paranoid nobles relaxed their guard slightly. Wine flowed, attention wandered, and opportunities presented themselves. Plus, the chaos of celebration helped mask the sounds of struggle or escape. The downside was witnesses. In a castle, you might only need to deal with a handful of people who saw you. In a city, dozens or hundreds might catch glimpses of your face, clothing, or escape route. Urban assassins had to master the art of becoming forgettable while remaining effective. Nothing says end of diplomacy like a dagger during dinner. Diplomatic assassination was a specialized field that required understanding protocol, ceremony, and the delicate art of violating hospitality customs. Mongol diplomatic assassinations were legendarily direct. They'd invite enemy leaders to negotiate, ply them with food and drink, then eliminate them when their guard was down. The message was clear. Diplomacy with the Mongols was a potentially fatal endeavor. Treaty negotiations were particularly dangerous for both sides. Everyone was armed, suspicious, and looking for advantages. A successful diplomatic assassin could end wars, start new conflicts, or completely reshape political alliances with a single well-timed death. The challenge was timing and escape. Diplomatic events were heavily guarded affairs with limited access points. You had to strike at precisely the right moment and have an exit strategy that accounted for immediate lockdown procedures. Not every target was a duke with a private army. Sometimes you just needed to make the local baker stop talking about what he'd seen, or ensure that a merchant rival had an unfortunate accident before the next trade season. Merchant rivalries and business disputes generated steady work for urban assassins. Commercial competition could be lethal when the stakes were high enough, and a well-placed accident could be cheaper than a lengthy legal battle. Witness elimination was bread and butter work. Someone saw something they shouldn't have, or knew something that could be dangerous if shared. These jobs were usually quick, simple, and paid reasonably well, the medieval equivalent of contract labor. Lower-tier assassination paid the bills while you waited for more lucrative opportunities. It also provided training and experience without the extreme security challenges of high-profile targets. Let's talk about what it was actually like to live as someone whose profession was making other people stop living. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great for your social calendar. Most European assassins had the social life of a plague victim for similar reasons. If your job was quietly murdering people, maintaining normal relationships became practically impossible. Paranoia was a professional requirement. Every knock on the door could be someone looking for revenge. Every stranger on the road might recognize you from a previous job. Every friend was a potential liability who might sell you out for the right price or under the wrong pressure. Tavern etiquette for professional killers was a delicate art. You sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes always scanning the door. You never drank too much, never stayed more than a night, and definitely never said your real name unless someone paid you first, and even then, it probably wasn't actually your real one. The psychological cost was enormous. Years of silent killings and quick escapes did something to your brain. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love because love was a vulnerability. You couldn't laugh too loud because drawing attention was potentially fatal. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man, always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the dark and no one noticed because no one ever really knew you were there in the first place. Community killers when murder had social support. Some assassins got to be part of communities where what do you do for work wasn't an awkward question. Religious assassin communities, particularly among the Nizaris, provided social support networks that made the isolation bearable. These weren't just professional relationships, they were spiritual communities. Nizari assassins lived together, prayed together, studied together, and died together. When you believed your mission was divine, having others who shared that belief made the deadly lifestyle sustainable. Court assassination was also accepted practice in some cultures. Byzantine palace officials who eliminated threats weren't outcasts. They were valued employees performing necessary services. The job came with social standing, reliable income, and something resembling normal relationships. The key difference was cultural acceptance. When your society viewed assassination as legitimate statecraft rather than criminal activity, you could maintain community connections, family relationships, and social standing while practicing your deadly trade. The cover story challenge. Maintaining a fake identity was like method acting, except if you broke character, you broke necks, your own. Specifically, professional assassins developed elaborate cover stories that had to withstand scrutiny from suspicious neighbors, curious authorities, and potential targets. Merchant covers were popular because they explained travel, irregular income, and why you might carry various tools and substances. Traveling spice trader was particularly effective. It justified exotic poisons disguised as rare seasonings and explained why you knew so much about foreign customs and languages. Legitimate businesses provided the best disguise. Some assassins actually ran successful bakeries, smithies, or other enterprises while practicing their deadly trade on the side. The business provided cover, income, and social credibility, plus regular customers who could vouch for your character. The occupational hazard was getting too attached to your fake life. More than one assassin reportedly struggled with genuine affection for the community they'd infiltrated, making their eventual departure emotionally complicated. Family planning for killers. Starting a family as an assassin was like bringing children to a knife fight. Technically possible, but ethically questionable and practically dangerous for everyone involved. Relationships were liability. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under the pillow. They asked inconvenient questions about your work, your income, and why you kept disappearing without explanation. Worst of all, they could be used against you by enemies seeking leverage. Some assassin families did exist, particularly in cultures where the profession was socially acceptable. Generational assassination families passed down techniques, contacts, and professional knowledge like any other family trade. These dynasties could be remarkably successful because they combined professional expertise with trusted support networks. But for most assassins, family was a luxury they couldn't afford. The few who tried often found that love and murder made poor bedfellows, creating impossible choices between personal happiness and professional survival. Part 6. Payment plans and pension problems. Let's discuss the economics of medieval murder, because even in the assassination business, somebody had to worry about cash flow and career sustainability. The gig economy, medieval style. Medieval assassins invented freelance work and all the financial insecurity that came with it. Most jobs were one-time contracts with payment terms that would make modern freelancers weep in recognition. When someone hired an assassin, they didn't want a long-term relationship. They wanted a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you. The classic deal was half up front, half when the job was done, but that was optimistic pricing for desperate times. When the job is done was code for, after we verify you didn't mess it up, make us look bad, leave a trail that leads back to us, or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. Payment disputes couldn't exactly be taken to court, and your only recourse for non-payment was threatening the same people who'd already proven they were comfortable hiring killers. Contract terms were usually verbal, vague, and heavily weighted in favor of the employer. You got a target name, maybe a deadline, and hopefully enough information to actually find the person. Details about guards, security, or special circumstances were extra, if they were provided at all. Professional versus amateur rates. Trained assassins could charge premium prices, while amateurs worked for food money and the promise of not being immediately murdered themselves. Market rates varied dramatically by region, target difficulty, and available talent pool. Religious assassins presented interesting economic disruption because they didn't negotiate salary. Nizari operatives worked for spiritual rewards rather than earthly payment, which made them simultaneously invaluable and economically devastating for professional killers trying to maintain market rates. Regional pay scales reflected local economic conditions and cultural attitudes toward assassination. Italian city-states had competitive markets with standardized rates for different types of elimination. Byzantine court positions offered steady employment with benefits. European freelance work paid sporadically, but could be lucrative for particularly challenging contracts. Supply and demand dynamics meant that during peaceful periods, assassination work was scarce and poorly paid. During political upheavals, civil wars, or succession crises, skilled killers could name their price, assuming they survived long enough to collect payment. The retirement problem. Medieval assassins didn't retire. They achieved involuntary career termination. The profession had zero job security and negative life expectancy. Most practitioners planned for short careers with violent endings rather than comfortable golden years. Exit strategies that actually worked were rare and required careful planning. Some assassins accumulated enough wealth to disappear entirely, purchasing new identities and relocating to distant regions where their reputations couldn't follow. Others transitioned into related fields like private security, military service, or organized crime management. The few success stories usually involve religious conversion, geographic relocation, and complete identity changes. A handful of former assassins reportedly became monks, hermits, or settled into quiet rural communities where they lived out their days under assumed names, never speaking of their previous careers. But for every successful retirement, there were dozens of corpses representing failed exit attempts. Former assassins remained valuable targets for revenge, blackmail, or simple elimination to tie up loose ends. The knowledge they carried made them permanently dangerous to their former employers. Part 7. Regional Specializations and Cultural Variations. The world of medieval assassination was remarkably diverse, with different cultures developing distinct approaches to the art of political murder. The Chinese approach art, philosophy, and throat cutting. Chinese assassins turned killing into a philosophical exercise. Confucian ethics provided frameworks for justified murder, distinguishing between assassination for personal gain and elimination for the greater good of society. Court intrigue in imperial China elevated assassination to high art. Palace eunuchs, scholar officials, and military commanders engaged in elaborate games of political elimination that made European court politics look like children's playground disputes. The scale was massive, the sophistication remarkable, and the body count astronomical. Chinese assassination literature treated the profession with respect and analysis. Stories like those in the records of the Grand Historian portrayed assassins as complex moral actors rather than simple criminals, when assassination was considered patriotic duty rather than criminal activity. It attracted better talent and more sophisticated methods. Imperial succession crises provided regular employment for Chinese assassins, with multiple wives, concubines, and potential heirs. Succession disputes could involve eliminating dozens of potential claimants and their supporters. These weren't individual contracts, but systematic elimination campaigns requiring extensive planning and coordination. Japanese honor killings, ninja versus reality before Hollywood ninjas in black pajamas. There were actual Japanese assassins who dressed sensibly and worked professionally. Shinobi operated as intelligence agents, scouts, and yes, occasionally assassins, but they bore little resemblance to their popular culture descendants. Real ninja wore normal clothes because black outfits were terrible camouflage, except in specific circumstances. They were farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who supplemented their income with espionage and elimination work. Many were actually part-time operatives rather than full-time killers. The honor culture of medieval Japan created interesting tensions around assassination. While direct combat was preferred, practical necessities sometimes required discreet elimination of enemies. This led to elaborate justifications for what was essentially professional murder, couched in terms of loyalty, duty, and service to one's lord. Japanese assassination often involved ritual elements that European killers would find baffling. Some eliminations were performed with specific weapons at particular times or with ceremonial components that elevated murder to religious significance. Mongol efficiency. Why complicate things? Mongols approached assassination like they approached everything, with overwhelming practical violence. Why sneak around with daggers when you could simply invite your enemies to a feast and kill them all at once? Diplomatic assassination was particularly Mongol in its directness. They'd propose peace negotiations, invite enemy leaders to discuss terms, then massacre the entire delegation. The message was clear and effective. Negotiating with Mongols was a potentially fatal endeavor. Mass elimination strategies reflected Mongol military thinking. Rather than targeting individual leaders, they might eliminate entire bloodlines, administrative classes, or potential sources of resistance. It wasn't subtle, but it was thorough. The Mongol approach to assassination was refreshingly honest about its purposes. They didn't pretend it was about honor, religion, or justice. It was about power, control, and the practical elimination of obstacles to their objectives. Northern European variations. In Scandinavia and Germanic regions, assassination had a distinctly Viking flavor that emphasized personal honor and public recognition over stealth and secrecy. Some Northern European assassinations were public events rather than secret operations. Challenge killings, honor duels, and revenge murders took place in full view of communities that expected and appreciated dramatic gestures of violence. Saga-worthy killing became part of cultural identity. Warriors gained reputation through spectacular eliminations that were remembered in stories, songs, and oral traditions. The goal wasn't to disappear quietly, but to achieve immortality through memorable violence. When murder was performance art, different skills mattered. Northern European assassins needed to understand storytelling, symbolism, and cultural significance as much as combat techniques and stealth methods. Part 8, the evolution and end of medieval assassination. Like all medieval professions, assassination eventually evolved out of recognition as technology, politics, and society changed around it. Gunpowder changes everything. Firearms didn't just change warfare. They made assassination a long-distance relationship. When you could kill someone from across a courtyard, which rather than requiring intimate contact, the entire profession transformed. Guns democratized killing by reducing the skill requirements for a successful assassination. You no longer needed years of training in blade work, poison preparation, or infiltration techniques. Point, shoot, run, assuming the primitive firearm actually worked and didn't explode in your hands. The end of castle invincibility meant that traditional fortress-based security became obsolete. When cannons could breach walls that had stood for centuries, the elaborate defenses that protected medieval nobles became architectural curiosities rather than practical protection. Early firearms were unreliable, inaccurate, and loud, but they changed the psychological landscape of assassination. The possibility of death from a distance made paranoia universal and traditional security methods inadequate. Professional armies and state control. As kingdoms got more organized, freelance killing became less freelance and more regulated by emerging nation-states. Central governments began monopolizing violence, including the specialized violence of political assassination. State intelligence services replaced individual assassins with bureaucratic organizations that provided training, equipment, support, and plausible deniability. Murder became institutionalized, professional, and disturbingly efficient. The transition wasn't immediate or universal. Freelance assassins continued operating in regions with weak central authority, but they increasingly found themselves competing with government and sponsored alternatives that had better resources and legal protection. Professional armies meant that rulers had reliable alternatives to assassination for dealing with threats. Why hire a killer when you could simply deploy soldiers? The cost-benefit analysis of discrete elimination shifted as military options became more available. Legal system development. Better courts meant fewer people solved problems with daggers. As legal systems became more sophisticated and reliable, assassination became less necessary for resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, or achieving justice. Alternative dispute resolution that didn't involve death became increasingly available. Commercial law, criminal justice, and civil procedures provided remedies that were cheaper, safer, and more predictable than hiring killers. Rule of law was bad for the assassination business because it reduced demand while increasing risks. When societies developed reliable mechanisms for addressing grievances, the market for private violence contracted significantly. Legal protections for witnesses, better investigative techniques, and more effective punishment systems made assassination both less necessary and more dangerous as a problem-solving method. Modern legacy medieval assassins didn't disappear. They got government jobs. Modern intelligence agencies represent the evolution of medieval assassination from individual freelance work to institutional professional service. The skill set never really vanished. It just became more specialized and bureaucratized. Contemporary assassins work for governments, have employee benefits, and operate under legal frameworks that their medieval predecessors would find bewildering. Intelligence agencies refine medieval techniques while adding technological capabilities that would seem magical to historical assassins. Poison became chemistry, infiltration became intelligence gathering, and assassination became with their targeted elimination with paperwork and oversight committees. The fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Powerful people still want their enemies dead, and other people are still willing to kill for money, ideology, or professional advancement. Only the methods, organization, and legal justifications have evolved, closing the final thread. So there you have it, the complete career guide to medieval assassination. From desperate European peasants to trained Persian operatives, from rusty daggers to Byzantine court intrigue, from religious fanatics to professional killers. It was a profession that offered travel, excitement, diverse working conditions, and a 100% guarantee that your retirement plan was die horribly. What's remarkable isn't just the variety of ways people found to kill each other for money, but the creativity humans brought to solving the fundamental problem of making inconvenient people disappear. Every culture, every region, every time period developed its own approaches, techniques, and justifications for professional murder. But maybe that's the real lesson here. Whether you were a religious fanatic in Alamote or a starving farmer in France, whether you had training or just desperation, whether you worked alone or as part of an organization, the ending was always the same, Beau. You didn't make history, you helped erase it. One quiet blade at a time. The successful assassins, the ones who achieved their objectives and escaped consequences, became footnotes in other people's stories. The unsuccessful ones became cautionary tales or simply vanished without trace. Neither group achieved the immortality they might have sought through their deadly profession. And perhaps that's fitting. The best assassins, like the best bedtime stories, are the ones that put you to sleep permanently. They served their purpose, completed their contracts, and faded into the shadows from which they emerged. Today, we can study their methods, analyze their motivations, and marvel at their audacity. But we do so from the safety of societies that have largely moved beyond solving problems with sharp objects and strong poison. We've institutionalized violence, professionalized elimination, and bureaucratized assassination until it's barely recognizable as the desperate, brutal profession it once was. Sweet dreams, everyone. Try not to check your locks too many times tonight. And remember, if someone from the medieval period could see how we live now, they'd probably be amazed that we've managed to make murder so much more efficient while making it seem so much more civilized. The thread of violence that connected desperate peasants with rusty daggers to trained operatives with sophisticated poisons still runs through human history. It's just wearing better clothes and carrying proper identification these days. But that's a story for another night, when we're ready to explore how the shadowy world of medieval assassination evolved into the shadowy world of modern intelligence services. For now, let's just appreciate that we live in an age where most of our problems can be solved without checking whether our dinner has been seasoned with more than salt and pepper. Sleep well. And remember, the most dangerous assassin is the one you never see coming, which, statistically speaking, is probably no one, because you're much more likely to be killed by poor diet choices or traffic accidents than by a professional killer, unless you're reading this while involved in international espionage, organized crime, or medieval reenactment gone horribly wrong, in which case maybe keep one eye open. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with nothing more threatening than the gentle whisper of historical footnotes and the soft rustle of pages turning in libraries where the only thing being eliminated is ignorance. This has been another journey through the fascinating, terrifying, and surprisingly complex world of medieval history. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember that the best way to deal with your enemies is probably not to hire someone to stab them. Legal systems exist for a reason, and they're generally cheaper than professional killers. though admittedly less dramatic. Sweet dreams. Part 2. Olympias, the serpent queen who gave birth to an empire. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia. Before she was the mother of Alexander the Great. Before she became the woman who turned palace politics into a blood sport with actual blood. She was just Polyxena, a princess from the mountain kingdom of Epirus, who worshipped guns that made civilized people nervous, and had opinions about snakes that would make modern herpetologists either fascinated or deeply concerned. Tonight we're meeting a woman who didn't just give birth to a conqueror, she engineered one. Think of her as the ancient world's most successful helicopter parent. If helicopter parents had access to armies, poison, and the kind of religious authority that made people believe your son was literally divine, Olympias made Cersei Lannister look like an amateur. She turned motherhood into a weapon, prophecy into propaganda, and palace intrigue into performance art. She was brilliant, ruthless, absolutely terrifying, and quite possibly the reason Alexander the Great conquered the known world, instead of ending up as just another Macedonian prince with daddy issues. So settle in as we explore the life of a woman who understood that behind every great man, there's often a terrifying woman who made his greatness possible through methods that would give modern parenting experts nightmares. This is the story of how a mountain princess became a serpent queen and gave birth to an empire. Let's start with young Polyxena. Growing up in Epirus, where the local entertainment consisted of worshiping Dionysus and claiming your family descended from Achilles. Epirus was basically the Wild West of ancient Greece, mountainous, tribal, and full of people who took their mythology very seriously and their wine even more so. The Molossian royal family, Polyxena's people, didn't just claim descent from heroes. They practically had a genealogy chart connecting them to half the characters in the Iliad. Whether this was true or creative marketing, it worked. In the ancient world, having mythological ancestors was like having a blue check mark on social media. It gave you credibility and made people take you seriously. But young Polyxena wasn't content with just inherited status. She threw herself into the mystery religions, particularly the cult of Dionysus, where worshippers engaged in ecstatic rituals that involved dancing, wine, and what polite society considered excessive enthusiasm for divine possession. These weren't your grandmother's church services. These were full-contact religious experiences. Now, about those serpents everyone loves to mention. Ancient sources love to tell us that Olympias kept sacred snakes and even slept with them, which sounds either deeply spiritual or deeply disturbing, depending on your perspective. Here's the thing. In Dionysiac worship, snakes were sacred symbols representing rebirth, wisdom, and divine power. They weren't pets, they were religious props. But here's where it gets interesting. Ancient historians, mostly men, had a fascinating habit of taking women's religious authority and turning it into scandalous gossip. So when they wrote about a powerful woman who used serpent symbolism in her religious practices, it became she literally sleeps with snakes. It's like an ancient game of telephone where spiritual authority gets translated into sensational tabloid material. The reality was probably more mundane, but no less significant. Polyxena was a high-ranking priestess who understood how to use religious symbolism for political authority. In a world where divine approval meant everything, being the woman who could literally handle serpents without being bitten was a pretty impressive credential. When Philip II of Macedon showed up at Samothrace for religious initiation, he wasn't just seeking divine favor. He was husband shopping, and not in the romantic comedy sense, but in the which marriage alliance will help me conquer Greece sense. Samothrace was like ancient LinkedIn for powerful people. Everyone who was anyone came to the island for mystery initiation, which involved secret rituals that bound participants together in religious brotherhood. It was networking with mystical overtones, and both Philip and Polyxena were there for business as much as spiritual enlightenment. Philip needed an Epirot alliance. Epirus controlled key mountain passes and had a reputation for producing excellent soldiers. More importantly, marrying into their royal family would give him legitimacy in Western Greece and potential support for his expansionist ambitions. Polyxena, now calling herself Olympias after her religious initiation, represented everything he needed: political alliance, religious authority, and impressive family mythology. Their wedding allegedly involved lightning strikes, which was either divine approval or the gods trying to warn everyone about what was coming. Ancient sources loved dramatic omens, but considering what happened next, maybe the weather was trying to tell them something. The marriage transformed Polyxena into Olympias, and the name change was more than cosmetic. She wasn't just acquiring a husband, she was acquiring a new identity, a new kingdom, and a new set of very dangerous in-laws. Macedonia wasn't Epirus. It was bigger, more violent, and full of people who had strong opinions about foreign queens and their strange religious practices. Marriage to Philip was like joining a very violent, very political sorority where your sisters-in-law might literally stab you. Not metaphorically, literally. Philip practiced polygamy for political reasons, collecting wives the way modern politicians collect endorsements. Each wife represented a different alliance, a different region, different strategic advantage. This meant Olympias wasn't just dealing with normal marital issues like whose turn it was to plan dinner or whether to redecorate the palace. She was dealing with a complex hierarchy of wives, each with their own agendas, their own children, and their own very valid reasons for wanting the others to disappear permanently. The court dynamics were brutal. Macedonian nobles viewed foreign queens with suspicion, especially ones who brought their own religious practices and talked to snakes. They saw Olympias as an outsider trying to influence their king with foreign ideas and mystical nonsense. She saw them as provincial barbarians who wouldn't recognize sophisticated statecraft if it bit them on their unwashed necks. But Olympias was nobody's victim. She quickly built her own power base, cultivating relationships with nobles who benefited from Epiro connections, priests who appreciated her religious authority, and anyone else who found her combination of intelligence and barely contained violence useful for their own purposes. The early warning signs that this marriage might be problematic included spouse collects wives like trophies, mother-in-law practices what neighbors consider witchcraft, everyone keeps weapons at dinner, and the local entertainment involves public executions that double as political theater. When Alexander was born around 356 BCE, Olympias didn't just become a mother, she became the CEO of the most successful divine marketing campaign in ancient history. This wasn't just about having a baby. This was about producing the future ruler of the known world. And she attended to make sure everyone understood exactly how special this child was. The pregnancy propaganda started before Alexander was even born. Olympias claimed to have prophetic dreams involving thunderbolts entering her womb, lions, and various other symbols that ancient dream interpreters would recognize as this child is destined for greatness. Whether she actually had these dreams or invented them for political purposes, they served their function perfectly. Philip allegedly had his own prophetic dream about sealing his wife's womb with a lion seal, which sounds uncomfortable for everyone involved but made excellent symbolic sense. The lion was Alexander's eventual symbol, and the dream suggested that Philip was the father of something wild, powerful, and ultimately untamable. Claiming Zeus was your baby daddy was ancient Macedonia's version of a celebrity endorsement. It elevated your child above ordinary political succession disputes and into the realm of divine destiny. If Alexander was the son of Zeus, then killing him wasn't just regicide, it was deicide, which came with significantly worse cosmic consequences. But the divine parentage claim served practical purposes too. In a world where legitimacy mattered for political survival, having gods in your family tree provided insurance against challenges to your authority. It's hard to argue with someone whose father allegedly controls lightning. The strategic importance of this mythology cannot be overstated. Ancient kingship wasn't just about political power, it was about religious authority. By establishing Alexander's divine connections from birth, Olympias was creating a narrative that would protect him throughout his life and justify whatever conquest he eventually undertook. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace had become less royal residence and more armed camp with really expensive furniture. Philip spent most of his time on military campaigns, leaving Olympias to manage court politics, raise their son, and deal with the increasingly complex web of rivalries that polygamous royal marriages inevitably create. Philip's absence created a power vacuum that everyone rushed to fill. Antipater, Philip's trusted general and administrator, effectively ruled Macedonia when the king was away. This put him in direct conflict with Olympias, who had her own ideas about how the kingdom should be managed and very strong opinions about who should be making decisions in her husband's absence. The tension wasn't just personal, it was political and cultural. Antipater represented traditional Macedonian values and the old noble families. Olympias represented foreign influence, religious innovation, and what conservatives considered dangerous changes to established order. They were fighting over more than just administrative authority. They were fighting over the future direction of the kingdom. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Philip was getting married again, this time to a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This wasn't unusual. Philip collected wives for political reasons, but this marriage was different. Cleopatra Eurydice was fully Macedonian, young, beautiful, and connected to powerful noble families who had always resented foreign queens and their foreign customs. Nothing says your marriage is over like your husband marrying someone younger, prettier, and more importantly, ethnically pure according to local standards. But for Olympias, this wasn't just personal humiliation. It was an existential threat to her son's future. The wedding feast where everything went wrong should have come with a warning label, may contain nuts, wine, and accusations of illegitimate birth that will lead to civil war. It was 337 BCE, and Philip was celebrating his marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice with all the subtlety and restraint you'd expect from Macedonian royalty, which is to say none whatsoever. The trouble started when Attalus, Cleopatra Eurydice's uncle and one of Philip's generals, got spectacularly drunk and decided this was the perfect moment to question Alexander's legitimacy. In front of the entire court, he proposed a toast, hoping that the marriage would produce legitimate heirs to the kingdom. The implications were clear and devastating. If Alexander wasn't legitimate, he couldn't inherit. If he wasn't Philip's true son, then all of Olympias's careful mythology about divine parentage was worthless gossip. If the new wife produced a pure Macedonian heir, then Alexander's mixed heritage would become a liability instead of an asset. Alexander, who had inherited his mother's temper along with her political intelligence, immediately threw his cup at Attalus and demanded to know whether he was calling him a bastard. Philip, drunk and caught between his son and his new in-laws, drew his sword on Alexander and promptly tripped over his own feet and crashed to the floor. The symbolism was perfect and terrible. The king of Macedon, drunk and fallen, unable to stand between his old family and his new one. Alexander looked at his father, sprawled on the ground, and delivered one of history's great burns. Look, men, here is the one who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, but who cannot even cross from one couch to another. Alexander stormed out. Olympias left for Epirus the next day, and Philip was left to contemplate the fact that his family dinner had just become a succession crisis. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding in 336 BCE, which was either the worst luck in history or the best time revenge plot ever executed. The killer was Pausanias, one of Philip's bodyguards, who had personal grievances involving sexual assault, public humiliation, and Philip's refusal to provide justice. But while Pausanias pulled the dagger, the suspect list for who might have wanted Philip dead was extensive and impressive. Political enemies who feared Macedonian expansion, Persian agents who didn't want Philip invading Asia, Macedonian nobles who thought he'd accumulated too much power, and yes, Olympias, who had excellent reasons to want her husband dead before he could produce legitimate heirs with his new wife. The evidence problem was that ancient investigations were basically who benefits, followed by can we prove it, followed by does it matter if we can't. Nobody really tried to solve the murder because everyone was too busy fighting over the succession. Olympias's alibi was being in Epirus, which doesn't mean being innocent. She had networks, agents, and the kind of political connections that could arrange convenient accidents for inconvenient people. More importantly, she had motive, means, and opportunity, the classic triad of successful assassination. But here's the thing about Philip's death. It might not have been a conspiracy at all. Pausanias had genuine personal reasons for violence, and Philip had made enough enemies through his policies that multiple people might have independently decided he needed to die. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one, even when the simple explanation is, powerful people make enemies who eventually kill them. Within days of Philip's death, Cleopatra, Eurydice, and her infant daughter were dead, which was either remarkable coincidence or remarkably efficient planning. The speed of their elimination suggests that someone had been preparing for this moment and knew exactly what needed to be done to secure Alexander's succession. The methods are debated. Some sources say Cleopatra Eurydice was forced to hang herself after watching her child be killed. Others claim both were burned alive. Still others suggest they were simply murdered in their sleep. What's consistent across all accounts is that they died quickly, thoroughly, and in ways designed to send a message about the consequences of threatening Alexander's legitimacy. The violence was both symbolic and practical. Symbolically, it eliminated the pure Macedonian alternative to Alexander's mixed heritage. Practically, it removed any future challenges based on competing bloodlines. The message was clear. Alexander was Philip's only heir, and anyone who suggested otherwise would face similar consequences. Alexander's response to these deaths is revealing and complicated. Ancient sources suggest he disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra Eurydice and her child, but he also didn't punish anyone for it or try to prevent it. This might have been political calculation. He needed the succession secured, but didn't want to appear personally responsible for killing a woman and baby. Or it might have been the complex, emotional reality of a young man caught between love for his mother and horror at her methods. Alexander would spend his entire career dealing with this tension between Olympias's effective but brutal political strategies and his own preferences for more honorable approaches to problem solving. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained behind, not as a passive grandmother knitting booties for future royal babies, but as the unofficial CEO of keeping her son's empire from falling apart through a combination of religious authority, political manipulation, and strongly worded correspondence. Her letter-writing campaign to Alexander was legendary. These weren't sweet maternal notes asking about his health and whether he was eating enough vegetables. These were detailed political briefings that analyzed threats, identified enemies, provided strategic advice, and occasionally included guilt trips that would make modern Jewish mothers proud. The content of these letters reveals a woman operating as an unofficial intelligence chief, policy advisor, and political strategist, all from hundreds of miles away. She reported on Antipater's activities, warned about potential rebellions, analyzed the loyalty of various generals, and provided constant updates on Macedonian politics. But she also functioned as Alexander's spiritual advisor and divine PR manager. She consulted oracles on his behalf, performed sacrifices for his success, and maintained the religious narratives that supported his divine authority. In a world where military victory was seen as evidence of divine favor, having your mother managing your relationship with the gods was a significant strategic advantage. Olympias's letters to Alexander were like ancient helicopter parenting. If helicopter parents had access to armies and poison and the ability to have people executed for annoying them, she had opinions about everything: his military strategy, his political appointments, his cultural policies, and especially his growing adoption of Persian customs. She particularly disapproved of his marriages to foreign women, his adoption of Persian court protocol, and his apparent belief that he might actually be divine rather than just politically divine. From her perspective, these developments threatened both his Macedonian identity and his political survival. Her political interference was constant and systematic. She undermined Antipater's authority whenever possible, cultivated alternative power centers among Macedonian nobles, and worked to maintain support for Alexander among religious authorities and traditional aristocracy. Alexander's responses to these letters reveal a complex relationship between a loving son and an exasperated emperor. He clearly valued her advice and took her warning seriously, but he also increasingly ignored her recommendations when they conflicted with his broader strategic objectives. The correspondence represents one of history's great examples of long-distance political management. Olympias was essentially running a shadow government from Epirus, while Alexander conquered Asia, and their letters constituted the administrative backbone of early Macedonian imperial administration. While Alexander was busy being a god king in Asia, Olympias was busy being the power behind a throne that was technically empty, but practically very much occupied by her political network and religious authority. Her regional influence extended far beyond Macedonia. She maintained connections in Epirus, Thessaly, and throughout northern Greece through a combination of family relationships, religious authority, and political alliances that she'd been building for decades. As a high priestess and queen mother, she wielded religious authority that complemented and sometimes superseded political power. She could consult oracles, interpret omens, and provide divine justification for political decisions in ways that made her indispensable to nobles seeking legitimacy for their actions. Her political networks were extensive and sophisticated. She cultivated relationships with noble families based on their loyalty to Alexander, their opposition to Antipater, or their general willingness to support her vision of Macedonian imperial administration. These relationships provided intelligence, political support, and when necessary, the ability to eliminate threats. The waiting game she played was masterful. She was simultaneously preparing for Alexander's eventual return as a conquering hero and planning for the possibility that he might die in Asia and leave her as the guardian of his legacy and any potential heirs. When word reached Macedonia that Alexander had died in Babylon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a royal proclamation with fanfare and official ceremonies. It arrived like a political earthquake that shattered every carefully constructed alliance and power balance in the Mediterranean world. Information traveled slowly in the ancient world, and the delay between Alexander's death and the news reaching home created a dangerous period of uncertainty. Rumors preceded facts, speculation replaced knowledge, and every ambitious general or noble had time to calculate their odds in the coming power struggle. For Olympias, the news was devastating on every level. Personally, she'd lost the son who had been the focus of her life's work. Politically, she'd lost the source of her authority and the protector of her position. Strategically, she faced a succession crisis that threatened to undo everything she'd worked to build. The immediate chaos was predictable and terrifying. Alexander had no clear adult heir, just an infant son by his Bactrian wife Roxana, and a mentally disabled half-brother who'd survived the various palace purges. The empire's generals, the Diadochi, immediately began positioning themselves for the coming civil wars. Olympias's position was simultaneously strong and vulnerable. As grandmother to Alexander IV, she had claims to regency and guardianship. As queen mother and high priestess, she retained religious authority and political networks. But as an aging woman without an army, she was dependent on alliances with men who had their own ambitions and limited patience for feminine interference. At around 60 years old, most women might consider retirement, perhaps some light gardening and spoiling grandchildren. Olympias considered civil war, because if there's one thing worse than losing a political struggle, it's losing it quietly without making your enemies pay for victory. Her alliance with Polyperchon represented a calculated risk. Polyperchon was one of Alexander's older generals who claimed to represent legitimate royal authority against the usurpers who were carving up the empire. Supporting him gave Olympias military backing and political legitimacy for her efforts to secure her grandson's inheritance. Her return to Macedonia in 317 BCE was a military campaign, not a family reunion. She came with an army, a plan, and a list of people who needed to die for the good of the realm. Her initial success was remarkable. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her cause. And even some of her old enemies hesitated to oppose someone with her reputation for effective revenge. But success made her dangerous to everyone, including her allies. Her revenge-killing spree eliminated Philip III and Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother who'd been used as a puppet king, along with his wife Eurydice. These weren't random acts of violence. They were strategic eliminations designed to clear the succession for Alexander IV. The executions were conducted with the theatrical brutality that had become Olympias's signature. She didn't just want these people dead. She wanted their deaths to serve as warnings to anyone else who might challenge her grandson's legitimacy. It was political messaging through spectacular violence. Cassander had been waiting his whole life to get revenge on the woman who'd made his father Antipater's life miserable. Now he had an army, unlimited resources, and no patience for negotiating with someone who'd spent decades trying to destroy his family's political position. The siege of Pydna in 316 BCE was less a military operation than a slow-motion execution. Cassander surrounded Olympias in the coastal fortress and simply waited. He had time, supplies, and the luxury of knowing that every day of siege made his eventual victory more certain. Olympias's isolation was complete. Her allies had abandoned her. Her resources were exhausted, and her political networks had either been destroyed or co-opted by her enemies. For the first time in her life, she was truly powerless, dependent on the mercy of people who had no reason to show her any. The negotiation attempts were probably insincere on both sides. Cassander offered safe passage, but Olympias knew better than to trust promises from someone whose entire political career had been built on opposing her. She'd made too many enemies and knew too many secrets to expect comfortable retirement. When she was finally handed over to the families of her victims for judgment, the symbolism was perfect. The woman who'd spent her life eliminating enemies would be eliminated by the relatives of her victims. It was poetic justice with a very sharp edge. The execution presented one final problem. Even at the end, Olympias was so feared that her executioners were too scared to swing the sword. When you are so terrifying that people won't kill you, even when you're defenseless and condemned, you've definitely made an impression. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed and abandoned. But history is strange. It doesn't always favor those who die in silk sheets, surrounded by loving family. Sometimes it remembers those who went down fighting, even when the fight was hopeless and the cause was lost. Her role in Alexander's rise cannot be overstated. Every rival eliminated, every alliance forged, every divine claim established. All of it traced back to a mountain princess who decided that if you're going to play the Game of Thrones, you might as well play to win. Without her ruthless clearing of his path to power, Alexander might have been just another Macedonian prince with good intentions and a short lifespan. The myth creation was perhaps her greatest achievement. The divine birth narratives, the prophetic dreams, the religious symbolism, all of this provided Alexander with the ideological framework that justified his conquest and sustained his authority. She didn't just give birth to a conqueror, she gave birth to a legend. Her political innovation was remarkable for its time and context. She demonstrated that female power could operate effectively in a patriarchal system through religious authority, family networks, and strategic violence. She created a model for queen mothers that would influence royal women for centuries. The strategic thinking behind her actions reveals a woman operating with remarkable long-term vision. She understood that Alexander's success depended on more than military victories. It required political legitimacy, religious authority, and the systematic elimination of alternative power centers. Most of what we know about Olympias was written by men who found powerful women either fascinating or terrifying, often both simultaneously. This creates significant problems for anyone trying to understand who she actually was versus who ancient historians needed her to be for their narratives. Historical bias in ancient sources is particularly problematic when dealing with female subjects. Male historians had cultural expectations about how women should behave. And when women like Olympias violated those expectations, the historians often responded by portraying them as either saints or monsters, with very little middle ground. The propaganda versus fact problem is especially acute with someone like Olympias, who spent her entire career creating and manipulating public narratives. How much of her reputation for supernatural abilities was genuine religious authority? And how much was political theater designed to intimidate enemies and inspire supporters? We're missing Olympias' own voice in her ruling. We have her actions and their consequences, but we don't have her explanations, justifications, or personal reflections on the choices she made. This leaves us guessing about her motivations and internal life in ways that might completely misrepresent her actual personality and decision-making process. The comparative context helps somewhat. Other powerful ancient women, Cleopatra VII, Livia, Agrippina the Younger, faced similar challenges and employed similar strategies, but each operated in different cultural and political contexts that shaped their options and outcomes. Whether you see Olympias as a villain or visionary depends largely on whether you think Alexander's empire was worth the blood it cost to create, and whether you believe that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary methods. The moral complexity of her life resists simple judgment. She employed brutal methods in service of goals that shaped Western civilization. She eliminated rivals to clear the path for conquests that spread Greek culture throughout the known world. She created myths that inspired one of history's greatest military leaders and most influential cultural movements. The historical impact of her influence extends far beyond Macedonia or even Alexander's empire. The Hellenistic world that emerged from Alexander's conquests influenced Roman culture, early Christianity, and ultimately modern Western civilization. If Olympias played a crucial role in making those conquests possible, then her legacy includes responsibility for cultural developments that continue to shape our world. The gender dynamics of her story remain relevant to contemporary discussions about power, motherhood, and politics. She demonstrated that women could wield political authority effectively, but only through methods that reinforce stereotypes about feminine manipulation and violence. Her success came at the cost of her reputation and ultimately her life. Modern parallels exist in political mothers and dynastic thinking throughout history. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to Rose Kennedy, powerful mothers have shaped their sons' careers through combinations of ambition, manipulation, and sacrifice that echo Olympias' strategies and dilemmas. Olympias' bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of bloodborne destiny, in every empire built on myth and maintained through carefully orchestrated violence. She wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside symbols of power, and outlived gods, kings, and the civilization that created her. She didn't just give birth to Alexander the Great. She engineered the conditions that made his greatness possible. Every rival eliminated, every alliance forged, every divine claim established, every religious narrative crafted, all of it traced back to a mountain princess who understood that myths are more durable than monuments and stories outlast stones. The real lesson of Olympias isn't about the morality of her methods or the justice of her causes. It's about the relationship between power and narrative, between motherhood and ambition, between personal desire and historical consequence. She understood something that many powerful people forget: the right story can make even death into victory. She was brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and probably terrifying to be around at dinner parties. She loved her son enough to kill for him, which might be the most intense expression of maternal devotion in recorded history. She played a game where the stakes were empires and the penalties were death. And she played it better than most of the men who wrote the rules. History remembers her as the Serpent Queen, and perhaps that's fitting. Serpents shed their skins, but never change their nature. They're dangerous when cornered, deadly when threatened, and absolutely beautiful in their perfect adaptation to a world that wants them dead. So sleep well tonight, and remember, behind every great man, there's often a terrifying woman who made his greatness possible through methods that would give modern parents nightmares. But maybe that's what greatness costs: someone willing to pay prices that ordinary people can't imagine, and make sacrifices that comfortable consciences refuse to contemplate. May your family dynamics be less politically complicated than ancient Macedonia. And may your maternal ambitions stop well short of religiously justified assassination. Though if you ever need inspiration for dealing with difficult in-laws, just remember, Olympias had solutions, even if those solutions involve consequences that modern legal systems generally discourage. Sweet dreams, and may you never love anyone quite as dangerously as the Serpent Queen loved her son. So we've met Olympias, a woman who turned motherhood into a weapon and family planning into a blood sport. She understood that the most dangerous power is personal, the ability to convince, manipulate, and when necessary, eliminate anyone who threatens your child's destiny. But long before Olympias was engineering Alexander's rise, there was a civilization that discovered something even more enduring than political power. They created mysteries instead of kingdoms, built legends instead of armies, and left behind puzzles that we're still trying to solve thousands of years later. Tonight we're traveling back even further, from the familiar brutality of Greek palace politics to a place so sophisticated and strange that when people rediscovered it, they could barely believe what they were seeing. Gentle pause. So settle in as we leave behind serpent queens and succession wars for a gentler mystery. The story of a people who built palaces like beautiful puzzles and then vanished so completely that they became the stuff of myths. Welcome to ancient Crete, where getting lost in a building was considered a feature, not a bug. Knossos, the palace that inspired 1,000 myths on the sun-bleached island of Crete, among olive groves and tourist buses filled with people clutching guidebooks and complaining about the heat, lies a ruin that feels more like a fever dream than archaeology. Stone corridors that twist and turn like ancient thoughts. Rooms that lead nowhere except to more confusion. Staircases that climb toward empty sky as if their builders forgot what they were building halfway through. This is Knossos, a palace so bewilderingly complex that it inspired one of humanity's most enduring nightmares, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But here's the twist that would have made ancient Greek storytellers weep with envy. The real story is stranger, more sophisticated, and infinitely more impressive than the myth. Tonight we're exploring a civilization so advanced they had flushing toilets, while the rest of Europe was still figuring out agriculture. So artistically sophisticated that their frescoes make modern art museums look underfunded, and so mysteriously vanished that we're still arguing about what happened to them nearly 4,000 years later. We're diving into a world where bulls weren't just animals, but cosmic symbols, where women apparently grabbed snakes like fashion accessories, and where the entire concept of interior design seems to have been invented by someone with a very creative relationship with architectural logic. So settle in as we explore the palace that launched 1,000 archaeological careers and twice as many theories, where every corridor leads to new questions and every answer spawns 3 more mysteries. This is the story of a people we can't name, speaking a language we can't read, practicing a religion we can't understand, but who built something so magnificent that we're still trying to figure out how they did it. First things first, these people weren't called Minoans. That's what Arthur Evans, a Victorian archaeologist with a flair for drama and a budget that would make modern university departments weep with envy, decided to call them after the mythical King Minos. It's like discovering an unknown civilization and naming them after Superman because they seem pretty impressive. The truth is, we have absolutely no idea what these people called themselves. They left behind thousands of clay tablets covered in a script we've cleverly named Linear A, which remains stubbornly undeciphered despite the best efforts of linguists who've been banging their heads against these symbols for over a century. This is different from Linear B, the script used by the later Mycenaean Greeks, which was successfully decoded in the 1950s by Michael Ventris, an architect who apparently did cryptography as a hobby because regular architecture wasn't challenging enough. Linear B turned out to be an early form of Greek used mainly for keeping track of sheep, grain, and who owed taxes to whom, basically ancient spreadsheets with more clay and less Excel. But Linear A remains a mystery, which means when archaeologists say, we believe the Minoans thought, what they really mean is we're making educated guesses based on broken pottery, damaged frescoes, and the kind of optimistic interpretation that makes academic careers. It's like trying to understand American culture by examining only shopping mall food courts and highway rest stops. You'd get some idea of what was happening, but you'd probably reach some very wrong conclusions about what these people value and how they live. Figuring out when things happened in ancient Crete is like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing. The other half might be from a different puzzle entirely, and someone's toddler has been helpfully chewing on the corners. The palace at Knossos was built around 1900 BCE, but it reached its peak during what archaeologists call the New Palace period from about 17 to 1450 BCE. These dates come with the kind of uncertainty margins that would make a weather forecaster nervous. We're talking about events that happened nearly 4,000 years ago, and ancient people weren't exactly keeping detailed calendars for the convenience of future archaeologists. The chronology gets even more complicated because Knossos wasn't built once and left alone. It was constructed, destroyed, rebuilt, renovated, expanded, damaged by earthquakes, repaired, redecorated, and generally treated like a Bronze Age home improvement project that lasted for centuries. Carbon dating helps, but ancient chronology is basically scientific best guessing with expensive equipment. When archaeologists say something happened around 1600 BCE, they mean probably somewhere between 1650 and 1550 BCE, give or take a few decades, assuming our calibration is correct and nothing weird happened to the organic material we're testing. It's precise enough to be useful, but imprecise enough that most ancient dates come with error bars bigger than most people's attention spans. Arthur Evans didn't just discover Knossos, he basically rebuilt it according to his Victorian imagination of what an ancient palace should look like, complete with concrete reconstructions, artistic interpretations, and the kind of confident restoration work that would make modern conservators break out in nervous sweats. Evans excavated Knossos in the early 1900s, when archaeological methods were, let's charitably call them enthusiastic. The idea of careful stratigraphic excavation and detailed documentation was still developing. So Evans and his team basically dug through the site like treasure hunters with academic credentials and unlimited funding. But Evans was also an artist and visionary who understood that pile of ancient stones wouldn't capture the public imagination. So he hired artists, architects, and craftsmen to reconstruct parts of the palace, complete with colorful frescoes, restored columns, and architectural details that may or may not have existed in ancient times. The result is that today's visitors to Knossos are basically touring Evans's fan fiction, written in reinforced concrete and painted plaster. It's beautiful, dramatic, and gives you a sense of what the palace might have looked like. But separating Evans's creativity from ancient reality is like trying to remove the sugar from cake after it's been baked. Modern archaeology takes a much more conservative approach. We photograph everything, measure everything, and argue about everything for decades before drawing any conclusions. It's more accurate, but significantly less visually impressive, which is why most archaeological sites look like organized piles of rocks to the casual observer. Knossos wasn't just big, it was bewilderingly, mind-bendingly. I need GPS to find the bathroom massive as Joamam. The palace covered roughly 150,000 square feet, which is larger than most modern shopping malls and considerably more confusing to navigate. The layout defied every principle of logical architectural design. There were over 1,000 rooms connected by corridors that twisted, turned, doubled back on themselves, and occasionally seemed to exist purely to confuse visitors. It's like someone designed a building by rolling dice, consulting ancient IKEA instructions, and asking a committee of architects to compromise on everything simultaneously. Unlike medieval castles, which were designed around defensive principles with clear hierarchies and logical flow patterns, Knossos was organized around a central courtyard system that branched out organically in all directions. Rooms were added as needed, corridors connected whatever needed connecting, and the overall effect was architectural jazz, improvised, complex, and requiring serious concentration to follow. The central courtyard was enormous, roughly 180 by 90 feet, and may have been used for religious ceremonies, administrative functions, or possibly the famous bull leaping performances. Everything else radiated outward from the central space in a pattern that makes sense once you understand it, but seems completely random if you're trying to find the exit. Storage areas were scattered throughout the complex. Workshops occupied seemingly random locations, and residential quarters were mixed in with administrative offices in a way that suggests either very integrated community planning or complete disregard for zoning regulations. While medieval Europeans were still debating whether bathing was sinful and wouldn't develop reliable indoor plumbing for another 1,000 years, The people of Knossos had indoor plumbing that would make modern hotels jealous, and ancient Romans take notes. They had sophisticated drainage systems that could handle both rainwater and waste, multi-story construction with what were probably the world's first flushing toilets, and water distribution networks that brought fresh water throughout the complex, clay pipes, settling tanks, overflow channels, and even what appear to be flush mechanisms. They solved engineering problems that wouldn't be addressed again until the Roman Empire got serious about aqueducts. The famous Queen's bathroom featured a terracotta bathtub with sophisticated drainage, decorated walls with dolphin frescoes that would make modern spa designers weep with envy, and what may have been running water on demand. It was luxury accommodation by any historical standard, and better than what most of the world had access to until very recently. But the real genius was in the details. They used light wells to bring natural illumination deep into the interior of the building, created passive cooling systems that moved air through the complex, and designed water systems that could handle both the daily needs of hundreds of residents and the occasional flash flood that Mediterranean weather likes to throw at unsuspecting civilizations. The engineering was so sophisticated that when Evans first discovered it, he assumed it must have been added later by Roman occupants. The idea that Bronze Age people could achieve this level of technological sophistication didn't fit early 20th century assumptions about ancient capabilities. Was Knossos actually a labyrinth? Well, that depends on whether you mean confusing building or underground monster prison designed to contain mythological human bull hybrids. There's no evidence for the literal labyrinth of Greek mythology. No underground maze, no monster containment facilities, no bones of Athenian tributes scattered around dark corridors. What we have instead is a building so complex and disorienting that ancient Greek visitors probably felt like they needed a trail of breadcrumbs to find their way back to the entrance. The word labyrinth itself might derive from labris, the double-headed axe that was a sacred symbol throughout the palace. If that's the case, then labyrinth originally meant house of the double axe, rather than maze where monsters live. Sometimes the most mysterious explanation is that there's no mystery at all, just linguistic evolution and mythological elaboration over centuries of storytelling. The palace layout was undeniably confusing, but it was confusing with purpose. Different areas served different functions. Access was controlled through choke points and corridors, and the overall design may have been intended to impress, disorient, or control the movement of visitors and residents. Think of it as ancient architecture with built-in crowd control and status signaling. Important people knew where they were going. Everyone else wandered around feeling confused and impressed, which was probably exactly the intended effect. The walls of Knossos were covered in art that makes modern museum collections look underfunded, and most contemporary interior design looks sadly unimaginative. These weren't just decorations, they were sophisticated artistic statements that required advanced techniques, expensive materials, and the kind of artistic vision that suggests a culture with both wealth and aesthetic sophistication. The fresco technique itself was remarkable. True fresco requires applying pigments to wet lime plaster, which means the artist has to work quickly and get everything right the first time. No corrections, no do-overs, no Photoshop. The results, when done well, are colors that remain vibrant for millennia, which is exactly what we see at Knossos. The artistic themes tell us something important about these people's priorities and worldview. There are no scenes of warfare, conquest, or military triumph. Instead, we see nature, movement, celebration, religious ceremony, and what appears to be genuine joy in living. Dolphins swim across bathroom walls, flowers bloom in eternal spring, and young people perform athletic feats that suggest a culture that valued physical skill and artistic expression. The color palette was sophisticated and expensive. True blue, made from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, royal purple from murex shells, and gold leaf applied with techniques that required both artistic skill and significant technological knowledge. This wasn't folk art, This was luxury decoration that required international trade networks and specialized craftsmanship. Imagine the Olympics. But instead of gymnastics routines performed on stationary equipment, athletes vault over charging bulls weighing several hundred pounds with attitudes that can charitably be described as murderous. Either these people were incredibly brave, had very different ideas about entertainment, or possessed athletic abilities that would make modern extreme sports enthusiasts look like cautious beginners. The famous bull leaping frescoes show young men and women performing what appears to be an elaborate acrobatic routine involving grabbing a bull by the horns, somersaulting over its back, and landing gracefully behind it while the bull presumably wondered what just happened. This was either the world's first extreme sport, the world's most dangerous religious ceremony, or the world's most elaborate suicide method. Archaeological evidence suggests this was a real practice, not just artistic imagination. We have bronze figurines showing the same acrobatic positions, written records from other Mediterranean cultures mentioning Cretan bull dancers, and enough artistic consistency to suggest that this was an established tradition rather than a one-time artistic fancy. But the safety considerations boggle the modern mind. Bulls are large, powerful, unpredictable animals with sharp horns and little patience for human acrobatics. The mortality rate for bull leapers must have been significant, which raises questions about whether this was voluntary athletic competition, religious requirement, or some combination of both. The gender equality aspect is particularly interesting. The frescoes show both male and female performers, suggesting that whatever this activity was, it wasn't restricted by gender. In a Bronze Age context, this level of gender integration in dangerous athletic activities was unusual and suggests a culture with different assumptions about physical capabilities and social roles than most of their contemporaries. Bulls weren't just animals to these people, they were walking, charging symbols of everything from fertility to cosmic power, which must have made everyday livestock management considerably more complicated from a theological perspective. The horns of consecration, stylized bull horns carved in stone, appear throughout Knossos and other sites across Crete. They marked sacred spaces, crowned important buildings, and generally indicated that whatever was happening in their vicinity had religious significance. When your religious architecture includes bull symbolism, your theology is definitely not for the squeamish. Bull symbolism in Bronze Age cultures typically represented power, fertility, regeneration, and the natural forces that humans couldn't control but had to appease. Bulls were associated with storm gods, earth deities, and the kind of divine power that could create or destroy civilizations depending on its mood. The double axe, or labrys, appears even more frequently than bull imagery. These weren't weapons. They were ceremonial objects associated with religious ritual and possibly with female deities or priestesses. The axes often appear in the hands of figures who seem to be conducting religious ceremonies, suggesting that they were symbols of religious authority rather than tools of warfare. The combination of bull and axe symbolism suggests a religious system focused on power, sacrifice, regeneration, and the mediation between human and divine realms. But since we can't read their religious text if they had any, we're essentially trying to understand their theology through their decorative choices, which is like trying to understand Christianity by examining only Christmas ornaments in church architecture. The famous snake goddess figurines are either ancient religious icons representing divine power and household protection, or the world's oldest action figures left behind by Bronze Age children with very specific toy preferences. Archaeologists are still debating, which tells you something about the certainty level of our interpretations. These figurines, bare-breasted women holding snakes in outstretched hands, were found in storage areas rather than shrines, which complicates their interpretation. Were they household deities, temple icons temporarily stored for safekeeping, or ritual objects used in ceremonies we don't understand? The snake symbolism is particularly complex. In many ancient cultures, snakes represented rebirth, wisdom, healing, and the connection between earthly and underworld realms. they shed their skins, appearing to die and be reborn. And they moved between surface and underground worlds in ways that suggested supernatural powers. But interpreting ancient religion from broken statues is like trying to understand modern Christianity from examining only crucifixes and nativity scenes. You'd get some of the symbolism right, but you'd miss most of the theological complexity, social function, and personal meaning that made the religion actually work for its practitioners. The goddess interpretation assumes these figures represented deities, but they might have been priestesses, mythological figures, or symbolic representations of concepts we don't have words for. The bare-breasted appearance might indicate divine status, or it might have been normal ceremonial dress, or it might have had meaning that we simply can't access from this temporal distance. These people were running international trade networks while most of Europe was still figuring out agriculture, which makes them either remarkably precocious or suggests that Bronze Age civilization was more sophisticated than most history textbooks admit. Their maritime technology was advanced enough to support regular trade routes that reached Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, Anatolia to the north, and Spain to the west. This wasn't casual coastal trading. This was systematic, large-scale commercial activity that required sophisticated ships, navigation techniques, and the kind of economic organization that could handle complex international transactions. We find Minoan pottery in Egypt, Egyptian objects in Crete, Mesopotamian cylinder seals in Minoan contexts, and evidence of trade relationships that span the entire known world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. They were basically the ancient world's merchant marine. If merchant marines controlled islands, built palaces, and had complex religious ceremonies involving bulls and snakes, the economic specialization was remarkable. Different regions of Crete focused on different products. Some areas specialized in pottery, others in metalwork, still others in textile production. This level of economic integration required central coordination, standardized weights and measures, and the kind of administrative sophistication that we associate with much later civilizations. The luxury goods trade was particularly impressive. They imported amber from the Baltic, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, and gold from various sources throughout the ancient world. This wasn't subsistence trading. This was luxury commerce that required significant wealth, sophisticated taste, and the kind of international connections that took generations to develop. For decades, scholars portrayed the Minoans as peaceful traders who solved problems with commerce instead of conquest. Basically ancient hippies with better interior design sense and more sophisticated plumbing. Recent evidence suggests reality was more complicated, which is usually the case when academics discover they've been romanticizing ancient civilizations. The Pax Minoica myth, the idea that these people maintained peace through trade rather than warfare, was partly wishful thinking by scholars who wanted to believe that sophisticated civilizations could exist without military violence. It was a nice theory that didn't survive contact with better archaeological evidence. Fortifications exist at several Minoan sites. Weapons appear in archaeological contexts, and the scale of their trade networks would have required military protection from pirates, competitors, and the various Bronze Age equivalents of hostile takeover attempts. You can't run a Mediterranean-wide trade empire just by being really nice to people and offering competitive prices. The naval power requirements alone would have necessitated military capabilities. Merchant ships needed protection, trade routes required patrolling, and commercial disputes sometimes escalated into conflicts that couldn't be resolved through diplomatic negotiation or bulk discounts. Recent archaeological work has identified what appear to be garrison towns, defensive installations, and evidence of organized violence that suggests a more militarized society than earlier interpretations acknowledged. They may have preferred trade to warfare, but they weren't pacifist. Minoan art, technology, and ideas spread across the Mediterranean like ancient viral content, influencing cultures from Egypt to Sicily and leaving traces that persisted long after the civilization itself had vanished. Egyptian tomb paintings show people in Minoan-style dress, bringing tribute or trade goods to pharaonic courts. Minoan artistic motifs appear in contexts far from Crete, suggesting either direct cultural influence or extensive imitation of Minoan style by other Mediterranean peoples. The administrative and religious concepts that appear in later Mycenaean Greek contexts show clear Minoan influence. Linear B tablets from the Greek mainland include loanwords that probably derive from the unknown language of Linear A. And Mycenaean and religious practices include elements that seem to have originated in Minoan tradition. Ideas traveled with goods along the trade routes, religious concepts, artistic techniques, technological innovations, and social practices spread throughout the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. Merchants, craftsmen, and diplomats carried both objects and knowledge between cultures. This cultural transmission was a two-way process. Minoan civilization incorporated influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other contemporary cultures, creating a sophisticated hybrid that was both distinctively Cretan and broadly Mediterranean in its scope and sophistication. Around 1600 BCE, the volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, exploded with the force of several nuclear bombs, which should have been civilization ending. Somehow, it wasn't, at least not immediately, which complicates our understanding of both natural disasters and Bronze Age resilience. The scale of the eruption was enormous by any standard. Volcanic ash from Thera has been found in ice cores from Greenland. Tree ring evidence suggests global climate effects, and the explosion literally blew the center out of the island, leaving behind the dramatic caldera that modern tourists admire while sipping wine and posting Instagram photos. Tsunami waves generated by the eruption would have hit the northern coast of Crete within minutes, potentially devastating coastal settlements and destroying the naval infrastructure that Minoan civilization depended on. Ash clouds would have blocked sunlight, disrupted agriculture, and generally made life unpleasant for anyone within several hundred miles of the explosion. But here's the complication: the timing doesn't quite work. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BCE, but Minoan civilization continued for another century or more before showing clear signs of decline. Natural disasters in the ancient world were like playing civilization on expert mode. One bad day could end your entire culture, but somehow the Minoans survived what should have been an extinction-level event. This has led to various theories about Minoan resilience, alternative dating for the eruption, or the possibility that the volcanic disaster was only one factor among many in their eventual decline. Ancient peoples were apparently tougher than we give them credit for, or the relationship between natural disasters and cultural collapse is more complicated than we assumed. The relationship between Minoans and Mycenaeans was like a Bronze Age merger that nobody really wanted, but everybody had to accept, complete with cultural integration, administrative awkwardness, and the kind of gradual power transfer that leaves historians arguing about whether it was conquest, absorption, or just really aggressive business competition. Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland began appearing in Crete around 1450 BCE, initially as traders, diplomats, or possibly mercenaries hired by local rulers, but their presence gradually expanded from commercial to administrative to political, eventually resulting in Greek control of Knossos and other major Cretan centers. The process wasn't necessarily violent. Linear B tablets from later periods show administrative continuity alongside cultural change. The same basic governmental functions continued, but now they were recorded in Greek rather than the unknown language of Linear A. It's like a corporate takeover where the new management keeps most of the employees but changes the paperwork language. Cultural absorption worked both ways. Mycenaean Greeks adopted Minoan artistic styles, religious practices, and administrative techniques, while Minoan traditions were adapted to fit Greek cultural patterns. The result was a hybrid civilization that was recognizably Greek, but retained many distinctively Minoan characteristics. Sometimes civilizations don't fall dramatically. They just get bought out by the competition. And the transition is so gradual that it's hard to identify exactly when one culture ends and another begins. The Mycenaean takeover of Crete might have been less invasion and more hostile merger with cultural benefits. Picking a single cause for Minoan decline is like choosing your favorite reason why Rome fell. there are too many good options. And the real answer is probably all of the above, with a side order of it's complicated. Yeah, climate change was almost certainly a factor. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced an increasing drought and agricultural stress during the late Bronze Age. When your civilization depends on agricultural surplus to support urban populations, craft specialists, and international trade, crop failures become existential threats. Internal political collapse is suggested by evidence of burning, abandonment, and disruption at various Minoan sites. Political systems that depend on central coordination can unravel quickly when the coordination breaks down, whether through succession disputes, administrative incompetence, or simple loss of legitimacy. Trade network disruption would have been catastrophic for a civilization that depended on international commerce. Bronze Age trade systems were fragile networks that could be disrupted by warfare, piracy, political changes, or economic competition. When your economy depends on imported tin to make bronze tools and weapons, supply chain problems become military vulnerabilities. Seismic activity was a constant threat in the eastern Mediterranean. Crete sits in an active earthquake zone, and repeated seismic damage to buildings, harbors, and infrastructure would have required constant reconstruction and resource allocation that drained the civilization's resilience over time. Ancient civilizations were basically held together by good weather, successful harvests, political stability, and everyone agreeing not to burn everything down simultaneously. When several of these factors failed at once, even sophisticated societies could collapse with shocking speed. Unlike Hollywood endings, real civilizations don't usually explode dramatically with special effects and orchestral soundtracks. They just slowly stop being important, like a battery running down or a party where people gradually drift away until only the host is left cleaning up empty cups. Archaeological evidence from Knossos and other sites shows gradual abandonment rather than sudden destruction. Rooms were closed off, maintenance was deferred, and administrative functions were scaled back over decades rather than destroyed in a single catastrophic event. Site continuity is important to understand. Knossos didn't become a ruin and stay empty. It continued to be occupied by smaller populations who used the existing structures for their own purposes. But the palace economy that had supported hundreds of specialists, administrators, and craftsmen was no longer sustainable. Cultural persistence meant that many Minoan traditions, artistic styles, and religious practices continued in modified forms under Mycenaean and later Greek rule. The civilization didn't vanish. It evolved into something different that retained some characteristics while losing others. The distinction between political disappearance and cultural continuity is as crucial. The Minoan state collapsed, but Minoan culture was absorbed, adapted, and preserved in ways that influenced Mediterranean civilization for centuries afterward. By the time Homer was composing epics about heroic adventures and divine interventions, Knossos was already ancient history, like us writing poems about medieval castles while trying to understand what life was actually like for people who lived in them 600 years ago. The time gap between the height of Minoan civilization and classical Greek literature was enormous, longer than the time between Shakespeare and the present day. Classical Greeks were encountering ruins, artifacts, and cultural memories that were as remote to them as ancient Egypt is to us. This temporal distance explains a lot about how Greek myths preserved and distorted Minoan cultural memory. Oral tradition is like a very long game of telephone played across centuries, where each generation adds their own interpretations, assumptions, and creative embellishments to stories they have inherited from their ancestors. King Minos in Greek literature bears about as much resemblance to any historical Minoan ruler as King Arthur bears to actual medieval British kings. The mythological Minos was a powerful, just, but sometimes cruel ruler who controlled the seas, demanded tribute from Athens, and kept a monster in his basement, which tells us more about Greek anxieties than about Minoan realities. Greek myths about Crete are basically historical fiction based on tourism to ancient ruins. Classical Greeks visited Knossos, saw impressive but confusing architecture, heard local stories about the good old days, and created narratives that combined archaeological observation with creative storytelling and cultural prejudice. The monster in the labyrinth might have been a garbled memory of bull sacrifice rituals, political tribute systems, or just really good ancient horror fiction that tapped into universal fears about getting lost, being eaten, and dealing with bureaucratic maze-like governmental systems. The tribute system described in Greek mythology, Athens forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete every 7 years, might preserve a memory of actual political relationships between Greek mainland communities and Minoan Crete. Bronze Age political arrangements often involve tribute, hostage exchange, or other forms of submission that could be remembered and mythologized over centuries. Bull-leaping rituals provide another possible source for monster imagery. If you're a Greek visitor to Crete, hearing stories about young people who performed acrobatic feats with dangerous bulls, and some of those performers didn't survive the experience. It's not a huge leap to imagine a monster that devoured young people in elaborate ceremonial context. The labyrinth itself might represent the actual complexity of Minoan administrative and religious systems. To outsiders, the palace economy with its elaborate bureaucracy, specialized functions, and intricate social relationships might have seemed like a maze designed to trap and confuse anyone who didn't understand how it worked. Theseus is the Greek hero who solved the labyrinth and killed the monster, represents typical Greek storytelling patterns. Clever Greek heroes overcoming foreign challenges through intelligence, courage, and divine assistance. It's propaganda disguised as adventure story, which is basically what most heroic literature is. After more than a century of archaeology, millions of dollars in research funding, and the application of every analytical technique from ground-penetrating radar to DNA analysis, we still can't read their writing, understand their religion, or explain their disappearance. And honestly, that's okay. Linear A remains undeciphered despite heroic efforts by linguists who've tried every possible approach from assuming it's related to known languages to treating it as a completely unique writing system. We can identify some symbols, understand that it was used for administrative purposes, and recognize that it recorded a language unlike anything else we know, but the specific content remains tantalizingly out of reach. Religious practices are particularly frustrating to reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone. But we have the symbols, the ritual objects, the architectural settings, and the artistic representations. But we don't have the prayers, the theological explanations, or the personal beliefs that made the religion meaningful to its practitioners. Social organization raises questions we can't definitively answer. Was Minoan society ruled by kings, queens, priests, merchant councils, or some combination we don't have words for? Were the palaces, royal residences, religious centers, administrative headquarters, or multifunctional community centers? The archaeological evidence supports multiple interpretations. The disappearance question involves so many variables: climate, politics, economics, demographics, technology, warfare, disease, natural disasters, that any comprehensive explanation becomes too complex to prove or disprove with available evidence. Sometimes the best archaeological discoveries raise more questions than they answer, which is actually a sign of healthy scientific inquiry rather than academic failure. Every year, archaeologists find new evidence that changes our understanding of Minoan civilization, which is both exciting for researchers and frustrating for anyone who wants definitive answers to historical questions. Recent excavations have identified new sites, uncovered additional frescoes, and provided evidence for more extensive trade networks than previously recognized. Underwater archaeology has revealed Bronze Age shipwrecks that illuminate ancient maritime technology and commercial practices. New analytical techniques allow us to extract information from artifacts that previous generations of archaeologists couldn't access. DNA analysis of ancient remains, chemical analysis of pottery and metal objects, and sophisticated dating methods provide data that can test or refine existing theories about Minoan society and culture. Climate data from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment cores help us understand the environmental context of Minoan civilization in ways that illuminate both their achievements and their vulnerabilities. Ancient peoples were more affected by climate variation than modern populations. And understanding those environmental pressures helps explain both cultural development and eventual decline. Changing interpretations of old evidence are just as important as new discoveries. Archaeological interpretation evolves as theoretical frameworks develop, and comparative data from other cultures provides new perspectives on Minoan material culture. The Minoans didn't just disappear into historical footnotes. They got absorbed, adapted, and recycled into the foundations of Western civilization in ways that most people never realized. Like cultural DNA that continues to influence modern life through channels so indirect we don't notice them. Mycenaean inheritance of Minoan culture was extensive and systematic. Greek administrative practices, artistic styles, religious concepts, and social organization all show clear Minoan influence that persisted long after the original civilization had vanished. When the Mycenaeans took over Crete, they didn't just conquer territory, they absorbed a sophisticated culture that enhanced their own capabilities. Greek cultural memory preserved Minoan influence through mythology, artistic traditions, and social practices that became part of classical Greek civilization. The legendary King Minos, the labyrinth stories, and various religious traditions that connected Crete with divine power all reflected genuine cultural transmission across centuries of political change. Roman awareness of Minoan civilization was limited but real. Roman writers occasionally mentioned the ancient glories of Crete, and Roman artists sometimes incorporated the motifs that ultimately derived from Minoan sources, filtered through centuries of Greek cultural development. Cultural influence works like recycling. Nothing really disappears. It just gets transformed into something new that serves different purposes while retaining traces of its original form. Modern Western civilization contains cultural elements that can be traced back through Rome and Greece to Bronze Age Crete, though the connections are so indirect that they're invisible to casual observation. Knossos changed how we study the past, mostly by showing us how wrong we could be while still learning important things, which is actually a pretty good description of how science works in general. Evans's methods were primitive by modern standards, but his approach to site interpretation was innovative for its time. He recognized that archaeological sites needed to be understood as complete cultural systems rather than treasure hunts for individual artifacts, even if his reconstruction methods wouldn't pass current peer review. The preservation versus interpretation controversy continues to influence archaeological practice. Modern archaeologists are much more conservative about reconstruction and much more careful about distinguishing between original ancient material and modern restoration. But they still face the challenge of making ancient sites meaningful to contemporary audiences. Scientific versus intuitive approaches to ancient cultures reflect broader tensions in archaeological methodology. Evans relied heavily on artistic insight and cultural intuition to interpret Minoan civilization, while modern archaeology emphasizes scientific analysis and quantifiable data. But both approaches have contributed to our understanding. The Knossos experience taught archaeologists that even well-intentioned restoration can complicate future research, and that the most helpful approach is often to preserve sites in their discovered state while using technology to help visitors understand what they're seeing. Why do we love the Minoans? Because they represent the perfect balance of knowledge and ignorance. We know enough to be fascinated, but not enough to be bored, which is exactly the sweet spot that keeps people interested in historical mysteries. The psychological appeal of ancient sophistication combined with lost knowledge scratches a particular intellectual itch. The Minoans were clearly advanced, artistic, and successful, but they're remote enough that we can project our own assumptions and desires onto them without being contradicted by inconvenient historical details. Modern parallels and projections are inevitable when we encounter ancient civilizations. We see what we want to see: peaceful traders, sophisticated artists, early feminists, environmental pioneers, or whatever characteristics we value in our own time. The Minoans become a mirror that reflects our contemporary concerns and aspirations. Tourism and popular culture have transformed Knossos from archaeological site into cultural icon. Millions of visitors experience Evans's reconstructed palace, creating shared cultural memories that blend ancient history with modern tourism infrastructure. The site exists simultaneously as historical artifact and contemporary attraction. The mystery aspect is crucial to the appeal. If we understood everything about Minoan civilization, it would be academically satisfying but culturally less compelling. The unsolved puzzles, the undeciphered script, the unclear religion, the mysterious disappearance. Keep the civilization interesting in ways that completely understood cultures often aren't. So here we are, standing in the ruins of Knossos with our guidebooks and theories, trying to make sense of a civilization that solved engineering problems we're still impressed by, created art that still takes our breath away, and then vanished so completely that we had to rediscover them by accident while looking for something else entirely. Maybe that's the real lesson of the labyrinth. It's not about monsters or heroes or even ancient plumbing, impressive as that plumbing was. It's about the fact that human beings have been building incredible things, creating beautiful art, and living complex lives for thousands of years longer than we usually remember. The Minoans remind us that our ancestors weren't primitive people waiting around for us to invent civilization. They were sophisticated, creative, problem-solving people who built palaces we still can't fully understand, created technologies we're still impressed by, and developed solutions to social and economic challenges that we're still working on. They had flushing toilets when most of the world was still figuring out agriculture. They created international trade networks when most peoples were still primarily local. They developed artistic techniques that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They built a civilization that lasted longer than the United States has existed and left behind mysteries that we're still trying to solve. But perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the real treasure isn't solving every mystery, but appreciating that there are still mysteries worth solving. That after a century of archaeology and analysis, the ancient world can still surprise us, still teach us, still make us reconsider our assumptions about human capability and creativity. The labyrinth of Knossos was never about trapping a monster. It was about creating a space so complex and beautiful that people would remember it for thousands of years. And in that sense, it worked perfectly. We're still walking through those corridors, still trying to understand what we're seeing, still being amazed by what ancient people could accomplish when they combined imagination with engineering skill. So sleep well tonight and dream of labyrinthine palaces where the corridors lead not to monsters, but to the endless, fascinating complexity of human civilization. May your own life's twists and turns be as purposeful as Knossos' corridors. And may your mysteries be as beautiful as theirs. Sweet dreams. And remember, Foster, sometimes getting lost is the best way to discover something wonderful. The Minoans built a maze that captured imaginations for millennia, which is exactly the kind of immortality that any civilization would envy. And if you ever find yourself in a confusing building with unclear signage and no apparent logic to its layout, just remember, you're not lost. You're having an authentic Bronze Age architectural experience. The Minoans invented the concept of buildings that make no sense to visitors, and we've been perfecting it ever since. Rest well, and may your dreams be filled with dolphin frescoes, impossible plumbing, and the gentle sound of ancient mysteries refusing to give up their secrets too easily.